The axe came down with a satisfying thud, splitting the log clean in two. Frank wiped sweat from his forehead despite the bitter cold. Up here in the mountains, winter was king, and winter didn't care if you were tired or lonely or broken. It just demanded respect. That's exactly how Frank liked it. He'd been chopping wood for the better part of an hour, building up his supply before the next storm hit. The weather reports on his old radio had been calling for a big one. Not that Frank minded storms. They were honest, at least. They didn't lie to you or make promises they couldn't keep. They just came, did their damage, and moved on. Unlike people, Frank had learned that lesson the hard way. Once upon a time, he'd believed in things like loyalty and forever. He'd believed in coming home to someone who cared, in building something that would last. The military had taught him about brotherhood and honor. His wife had taught him about love and trust. Both had taught him about betrayal. The war had changed him. He knew that much. The man who'd left for overseas wasn't the same one who'd come back. That man had seen too much, done too much. His hands shook sometimes, and his sleep was full of sounds that most people would never hear. When he'd returned home, he'd tried to be the husband his wife remembered. He'd tried to smile and laugh and pretend the world was still the same bright place it had been before, but she'd seen through it all. First, she'd been patient. She'd held him when the nightmares came and listened when he tried to explain things he could barely understand himself. She'd promised she'd stay, promised they'd work through it together. For a while, Frank had believed her. He'd thought love was strong enough to bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. He'd been wrong. The distance had grown slowly, like ice forming on a lake. Her smiles became forced. Her touch became rare. Conversations turned into arguments, and arguments turned into cold silence. Then came the late nights when she claimed to be working. The phone calls she'd taken another room. The way she'd look at him sometimes, like he was a stranger who'd wandered into her house. When she finally left, Frank hadn't been surprised. Hurt, yes. Angry, definitely. But not surprised. People always left, one way or another. The war had taught him that too. So he'd packed up what little mattered to him and driven north. He'd kept driving until the roads turned to dirt, then to gravel, then to nothing at all. He'd found this place, a few acres of wilderness where the only sounds were wind and wildlife, where the only company was his own thoughts. He'd built his cabin with his own hands, chopped his own wood, learned to live on his own terms. No schedules to keep, no one to disappoint, no one to let him down. The mountain didn't judge him for the scars on his hands or the darkness in his past. It just existed, solid and unchanging, exactly what Frank needed, or so he'd thought. The first explosion shattered the evening quiet like a gunshot. Frank's axe froze mid-swing. The sound rolled across the valley, echoing off the mountain walls in a series of thunderous booms. Birds erupted from the trees in panicked clouds, their cries adding to the chaos. The ground beneath Frank's feet trembled, and loose snow cascaded from the pine branches above him. What the hell? He muttered, setting down the axe. Then he saw it, a streak of brilliant blue light tearing across the dark sky like a wounded comet. It moved fast, leaving a glowing trail that burned against his retinas. The light pulsed and flickered as it descended, and Frank could swear he heard a sound like screaming metal cutting through the air. The impact, when it came, was tremendous. The shockwave hit Frank like a physical blow, knocking him backward into the woodpile. The cabin windows rattled in their frames. More snow fell from the trees, this time in thick, heavy sheets that send up clouds of powder when they hit the ground. A flock of deer burst from the underbrush and bounded away into the darkness, their white tails flashing like warning flags. Frank pushed himself to his feet, brushing snow from his jacket. His military training kicked in, automatically assess the situation, identify threats, take action. His eyes scanned the forest beyond the cabin, searching for the source of the disturbance. There, about a quarter-mile into the tree line, an orange glow flickered between the trunks. Not the warm, steady light of a campfire, but something harsher, more urgent. Smoke rose in thin columns, and Frank caught the sharp smell of burning pine carried on the wind. Every instinct told him to stay put. Whatever had crashed out there, it wasn't his problem. He'd come to these mountains to get away from problems, to avoid the complications that came with getting involved in other people's disasters. His life was simple now, predictable. He liked it that way, but his feet were already moving. Frank cursed under his breath as he grabbed his rifle from inside the cabin. He slung it over his shoulder and picked up a heavy flashlight, testing the beam. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered path that led into the forest. He'd just take a look, he told himself. Just see what had happened. If it was a plane crash, maybe there were survivors who needed help. If it was something else, well, he'd deal with that when he came to it. The trek through the forest was harder than usual. The explosion had stirred up the snow, creating deep drifts that came up to Frank's knees in places. Branches that had been weighed down by ice now hung lower, forcing him to duck and weave as he made his way toward the glow. The smell got stronger. As he walked, not just burning wood, but something else. Something metallic and sharp that made his nose wrinkle. It reminded him of electrical fires, of machines pushed too hard and too fast until they overheated and died. Steam rose from the snow ahead, creating ghostly shapes in the beam of his flashlight. The temperature was rising as he got closer to whatever had crashed. Ice melted into slush under his boots, and the air grew thick with moisture. Then he saw the crater. It was maybe 20 feet across, carved deep into the frozen earth. The trees around it were stripped bare, their bark scorched black, their branches snapped and scattered like kindling. At the center of the crater, the snow had melted completely, leaving bare ground that still steamed in the cold air. And there, curled up in the middle of it all, was a woman. Frank stopped dead in his tracks. She wasn't human. That much was clear, even from a distance. Her skin was the color of deep ocean water, a blue so rich it seemed to glow in the darkness. Her hair was silver white, spread across the mud like spilled mercury. She was small, delicate looking, but there was something about her that suggested strength, like a blade that looked fragile but could cut through steel. She was barely dressed, wearing what looked like the remains of some kind of bodysuit that had been torn to ribbons. Her limbs twitched weakly, and Frank could see that she was shivering despite the heat that still radiated from the crater. Frank's grip tightened on his rifle. Was she dangerous? Probably. Was she dying? Definitely. He took a careful step closer. Then another. The woman's eyes fluttered open, large, golden eyes that seemed to catch and hold the light like a cat's. They were unfocused, glassy with pain or exhaustion, but they tracked his movement with an intelligence that made Frank's pulse quicken. Her lips moved, barely a whisper escaping. Frank couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. She was asking for help. Frank stood there for a long moment, torn between caution and compassion. This was exactly the kind of complication he'd come to the mountains to avoid. Whatever this woman was, wherever she'd come from, helping her would mean getting involved in something he couldn't understand or control. But she was dying, and despite everything he'd been through, despite all the ways the world had let him down, Frank couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. Damn it, he muttered, slinging the rifle over his back. He moved carefully down into the crater, testing each step on the uncertain ground. The heat was intense, like standing too close to a bonfire, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. The woman watched him approach, her golden eyes following his every movement. When he knelt beside her, Frank could see the extent of her injuries. Bruises covered her blue skin like dark stains, and there were cuts along her arms and legs that looked like they'd been made by something sharp and jagged. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath visible in the cold air. "Easy," Frank said softly, the way he might speak to a wounded animal. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's eyes focused on his face, and for a moment, Frank felt like she was looking right through him, seeing things he'd never shown anyone. Then her lips moved again, and this time he heard the word clearly: help. Her voice was weak but undeniably human-like, with just a hint of something else, an accent he couldn't place, a musical quality that seemed to resonate in his chest. It was the voice of someone who was used to being strong, used to being in control, now reduced to begging a stranger for mercy. Frank felt something shift inside his chest, a feeling he'd thought was long buried. Without thinking too hard about it, he reached out and touched her cheek. Her skin was cold, not just winter cold, but the kind of cold that came from the inside, the kind that meant life was slipping away. "You're freezing," he said, more to himself than to her. The woman's eyes drifted closed, and for a terrifying moment, Frank thought he'd lost her. Then her hand moved, weak and trembling, reaching toward him. Her fingers were tipped with what looked like claws, but they barely grazed his wrist as she tried to hold on. Frank made his decision. He slipped his arms under her, lifting her carefully from the steaming ground. She was impossibly light, like She was made of hollow bones and air. The moment he picked her up, she curled into his chest with a soft sound that might have been relief. Her claws caught in his jacket, holding on with what little strength she had left. Each breath she took was a struggle, rattling in her chest like leaves in the wind. Frank could feel her heart beating against his chest, to slow, to weak, but still fighting. The walk back to the cabin felt like it took forever. The woman creature, alien, whatever she was, grew heavier in his arms as exhaustion took hold of her. By the time Frank reached his door, she was completely unconscious, her head lolling against his shoulder. Frank kicked the door open and stepped into the blessed warmth of his cabin. The fire was still burning in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. After the cold of the forest, the heat felt like a physical thing, wrapping around them both. The woman stirred in his arms, making a soft sound that wasn't quite human but wasn't entirely alien either. It was the sound of someone who had been cold for too long finally finding warmth. Frank carried her to the couch near the fireplace and set her down gently. She immediately curled up, trying to conserve what little body heat she had. Her silver hair fell across her face, and Frank could see that her lips had a faint blue tinge that had nothing to do with her natural coloring. He grabbed every blanket he could find and wrapped them around her, creating a cocoon of warmth. She burrowed into the covers with a shiver that seemed to come from her very bones. Frank sat back on his heels, studying her. Up close, she was even more otherworldly. Her skin had a subtle shimmer to it, like light on water. Her hair wasn't just silver, it seemed to contain its own light, catching the firelight and reflecting it back in soft, ethereal patterns. But it was her injuries that worried him most. The bruises were darker now, and the cuts looked deeper than he'd first thought. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had brought her crashing down from the sky, it had been violent. Frank pressed 2 fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse. It was there, steady, but slow, definitely not human normal. Her breathing was getting easier though, and some color was returning to her face. "What are you?" he whispered, as if in answer. Her eyes fluttered open. They were clearer now, more focused, and Frank found himself caught in their golden depths. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she spoke, her voice stronger than before but still barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The words were simple, but the gratitude behind them was overwhelming. Frank felt that same strange shift in his chest, like something frozen was starting to thaw. "Don't thank me yet," he said, standing up. "You're still in pretty bad shape." He moved to the kitchen area and filled a kettle with water, setting it on the wood stove to heat. Tea wouldn't cure whatever was wrong with her, but it might help with the hypothermia. As he worked, he kept glancing back at her, half expecting her to disappear like a dream, but she was still there, watching him with those incredible eyes. There was something about the way she looked at him, not with fear or suspicion, but with a kind of trust that Frank wasn't sure he deserved. The kettle whistled, and Frank poured the hot water over dried herbs in a large mug. The scent of chamomile filled the cabin, homey and comforting. He carried the mug back to the couch and knelt beside her. "Think you can drink this?" he asked. She tried to sit up, but her arms were too weak to support her. Frank slipped an arm behind her shoulders, helping her into a sitting position. She leaned heavily against him, and he could feel how fragile she was, how close she'd come to not making it at all. He held the mug to her lips, and she took a careful sip. Her eyes widened slightly, and Frank wondered if she'd ever tasted anything like chamomile tea before. She took another sip, then another, and gradually her shivering began to ease. "Better?" Frank asked. She nodded, a small movement that seemed to take tremendous effort. Her eyes met his again, and Frank saw something in them that made his breath catch a recognition, as if she knew exactly what kind of man he was and accepted him anyway. "My name is Frank," he said, not sure why it seemed important to tell her. Her lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Frank," she repeated, and somehow his name sounded different in her voice, softer, more significant. "What's yours?" he asked. She was quiet for so long that Frank thought she might not answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Zara, Zara," Frank repeated, tasting the name. It suited her somehow, exotic, mysterious, beautiful. She finished the tea and settled back into the blankets, her eyes drifting closed again. But this time, Frank could see that it was sleep, not unconsciousness. Her breathing was deeper, more regular, and the worst of the blue tinge had faded from her lips. Frank sat back in his chair, watching her sleep. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and snow continued to fall. By morning, the crater would be covered, and any evidence of what had brought Zara to his mountain would be buried beneath a blanket of white. He should have been worried. Should have been planning what to do when she woke up, wondering if others would come looking for her, questioning whether he'd made the right choice in bringing her here. Instead, he found himself thinking about the way she'd said his name, the trust in her eyes, the feeling of being needed again after so many years of solitude. Frank pulled an old quilt over his lap and settled into his chair for the night. Tomorrow would bring its own problems, its own questions. But for now, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. Snow battered against the windows, the storm growing worse. Whatever had brought her here, wherever she was from, it didn't matter tonight. The clerk at the motel scrutinized Maddie, and they went up the stairs. He gestured towards the lobby right now. All that mattered was keeping her alive. Tomorrow he'd figure out the rest. Frank had spent years in these mountains alone. He had built his life around silence, around the comforting certainty that no one would come knocking on his door, that he didn't have to answer to anyone out here. He owed nothing, expected nothing, yet now in the dim glow of the dying fire he wasn't alone, and she was too close. Frank woke with a sharp inhale, his instincts firing before his mind cold catch up the way to against. His chest was unfamiliar, the presence beside him unnatural. His fingers twitched toward the knife under his pillow, but the second his brain cleared, he froze. The alien woman, the one he had dragged from the snow, the one who had barely clung to life hours ago, was wrapped around him like a damn security blanket, her long slender arm draped over his torso, her fingers curled against his ribs as if she had meant to hold on to him, but lost strength. Halfway through, one of her legs had slipped between his, the sharp contrast of her still cool skin pressing against the warmth of high sound, and then there was her face nestled against his neck. Frank's body tensed. What hell, his first instinct was to pry her off, to put some much needed space between them, but the moment he shifted, she stirred. Her grip on his shirt tightened, her breath cooler than a human's brushed against his collarbone. He stayed completely still, his mind racing. He had left her by the fire, he had made sure of it. She had been curled up, tucked under blankets, recovering from what should have been a fatal level of cold. Yet somehow, in the middle of the night, she had found him. Frank clenched his jaw, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. He should wake her. He should demand an explanation, but something about the way she clung to him sound-consciously so desperately made his throat tighten. She hadn't done this out of some strange alien custom. This wasn't instinct or habit, this was survival. A slow exhale escaped him. He had spent years convincing himself he didn't care about anyone, that human connection was a thing of the past, yet here he was lying awake in the dark, feeling something dangerously close to protectiveness for a woman who wasn't even human. He should move. He had to move, but before he could, her breathing changed. The soft rise and fall of her chest grew steadier, her fingers twitching slightly against his ribs. Then slowly she stirred. Frank forced himself to remain still as she woke. Her golden eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. For a moment she didn't seem to register where she was, her pupils dilating as they adjusted to the dim light. Then her gaze locked onto his. They stared at each other. Frank expected panic, maybe embarrassment. Instead, she simply watched him, calm and assessing, as if she were still deciding whether or not he was real. Then, in a voice rough with sleep, she murmured, "You are warm." Frank exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I got that part." She didn't move away. If anything, she seemed more content now that he was awake, as if that simple fact reassured her. Frank gritted his teeth. "You want to explain why you're in me bed?" She blinked slowly. "I was cold." His eye twitched. "You were by the fire." "The fire is not alive." Frank frowned. "What does that mean?" She tilted her head slightly, considering her words. "Fire gives heat, but it does not hold. It does not protect. Your warmth is constant." Frank ran a hand down his face. "Unbelievable. You can't regulate your body temperature, can you?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not like you." Something heavy settled in Frank's chest. He had assumed she had just been suffering from hypothermia, but if her body naturally struggled to retain heat, that meant she wasn't just trying to get warm. She was trying to stay alive. He exhaled slowly. "Damn it." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "Are you angry?" Frank opened his mouth to say yes, that he was frustrated that he hadn't signed up for this, that he had built a life away from people for A reason, but the words didn't come because the truth Wash wasn't angry, he was concerned turned, and that realization pissed him off more than anything. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, entangling himself from her hold as gently as possible. The cold hit instantly, but he ignored it, rubbing a hand over his face. You should have woken me up, he muttered. She watched him carefully, still lying where he had left her. Would you have allowed it? Frank hesitated. She had him there. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Look, if this is going to be a thing, it is. His brow furrowed. You didn't even let me finish. It did not need to. Frank huffed a quiet laugh, despite himself unbelievable. She shifted slightly, sitting up against the pillows. The blanket slipped off her shoulder, spizzing the blue skin of her collarbone, and for the first time Frank noticed something else. Scars, not just one or two, dozens. Thin pale lines ran along her arms and shoulders, barely visible against her iridescent skin. Some were jagged, others greasy. They weren't recent, but they told a story he didn't have the right to ask about. Not yet, but it changed something. This wasn't just a woman who had crash-landed into his life by accident. This was someone who had survived something. And suddenly the way she clung to warmth to him made more sense. She had lived through cold before. She wasn't going to let it take her now. Frank exhaled sharply and stood. All right, I'm making coffee. You want more tea? She blinked as if surprised by the offer, then slowly she nodded. Frank moved toward the kitchen, still trying to convince himself that this wasn't a mistake, that taking her in, keeping her here, wasn't going to unravel everything he had built for himself. But as he poured water into the kettle, he already knew the truth. It was too late for that. Frank had always been a man of simple rules. Keep your distance, don't let people in, never let your guard down. Out here in the wilderness, rules kept him alive. They gave him structure, control. But ever since she had fallen from Thesky, those rules had been unraveling. And now, as he stood in his cabin watching her sip tea with delicate fingers wrapped in his blanket, golden eyes flickering in the firelight, he realized one thing. He wasn't sure he wanted them anymore. She looked up suddenly, her gaze sharp, despite the exhaustion, still clinging to her. You are staring. Frank grunted. Thank. She tilted her head slightly, studying him like she was trying to decipher a language she hadn't quite mastered. You do that often? He huffed a quiet laugh. Well, you give me a lot to think about. She said nothing at first, then softly murmured, do you regret helping me? Frank frowned. He hadn't expected that Heshold have. He had given every reason to think he was hesitant about this whole situation, and he was, but regret no, he admitted. She seemed to consider his answer carefully, then set the empty mug down. You are cautious. You do not trust me. Frank exhaled slowly. Don't trust anyone. She nodded as if she had already known that because you have been betrayed before. Frank's muscles tense, said she was watching too closely now, reading him too well. He didn't like that beaut. Instead of snapping at her, he simply asked, and you trust me? A pause. Feeny do not know. Fair enough. Frank ran a hand through his hair. Listen, if we're going to be stuck here together, we need to set some ground rules. She blinked. Rules? Yeah. First rule, no sneaking into my bed at night. She didn't react the way expected. No embarrassment, no flustered apologies. She simply tilted her head again and asked why. Frank clenched his jaw. Because it's weird. She frowned slightly. You said I called ask if I needed warmth, but I was cold. Doesn't mean you crawl into my bed without warning? She considered that for a moment, then, with a hint of mischief in her voice, said, would you prefer I warn you first? Frank groaned. That's not the point. Her lips pressed together in what might have been the ghost of a smirk. Edo, not understand your objection. You provided warmth. I sought it. I do not see the problem. Frank rubbed a hand down his face. Of course you don't. She shifted slightly under the blanket, exposing the smooth curve of her collarbone, the deep blue of her skin glowing in the light. Her golden eyes never left his. Your warmth is different, she said softly. Frank swallowed. What does that mean? She hesitated. Then, choosing her words carefully, she murmured, fire fades. It does not hold. But you linger. Frank didn't know what to say to that. She was too close again, not physically. She was still seated on the couch, blanket draped over her shoulders. But there was something in the air between them. Something he wasn't ready to name. He needed to break it now. Second rule, he said roughly, forcing his voice to stay steady. No more dodging my questions. She tensed slightly. I have answered when I can. You admitted you're hiding something, Silentithin? Finally she said yes. Frank exhaled through his nose, and she looked down at the empty mug, fingers tightening around the handle. Then finally she whispered, "I was not meant to survive." The words sent a sharp jolt through his chest. "What?" She swallowed, still not looking at him. "My ship. It was never meant to land. It was meant to burn." Frank stared at her. "You're saying someone wanted you dead?" She nodded. Ansa Frank felt something dark settle in his gut. He had assumed she had crashed by accident, that she had fallen from the sky because of some freak mechanical failure, but if someone had tried to kill her, then this wasn't over and neither of them was safe. Heinhold deeply trying to push away the protective instinct rising in his chest. She shook her head. "I do not know, but if they learn I am still alive, they will come." Frank's grip tightened into fists. This was exactly what he had avoided for years, troubled anger entanglements, but looking at her now, at the way her hands trembled slightly despite her calm exterior, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't letting anyone finish what they started, not while she was under his roof. Before he could say anything, she moved. In one fluid motion she rose from the couch and stepped toward him, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Frank barely had time to react before she was standing in front of him, close enough that he could feel the faint chill still clinging to her skin. She placed a hand against his chest, right over his heart. "You are steady," she murmured. Frank swallowed hard. "Yeah. So I've heard." She searched his face, her golden eyes flickering with something Heckle didn't quite read. Then slowly she tilted her chin up. Frank saw it coming and he didn't stop it. Her lips brushed against his, soft but searching, hesitant but intent. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a question, and without thinking Franken's he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, his hands finding the curve off her waist. She pressed against him, drinking in his heat like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Maybe it was. Her fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. And for the first time in years, Frank let himself forget the rules, forget the isolation, forget the past. Because right now, in this moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was her and the warmth they shared. Frank wasn't sure what woke him first, the pale morning light seeping through the cabin window or the warmth pressed against his side. For a moment he wasn't in the mountain. He wasn't alone. The past didn't weigh on him like a ghost he couldn't shake. Then the events of the night came rushing back. The kiss, the way she had melted against him, drinking in his heat as if she had found something she had been searching for. The way he had given in, breaking every rule he had spent years enforcing. Frank exhaled slowly, staring at the ceiling, willing his heartbeat to slow. Beside him she stirred, her silver hair, still tangled from sleep, fanned out over his pillow. Her blue skin, faintly iridescent in the morning light, was warmer now, a softness to it that hadn't been there before. One of her hands rested lightly on his chest just over his heart, as if she had fallen asleep, counting his breaths. Frank let himself watch her. For a moment she wasn't human, but in sleep she looked just as fragile as one. Her golden eyes flickered open for a moment. She simply stared at him as if still processing where she was. Then slowly she pressed her palm a little firmer against his chest as if grounding herself. "You are still here?" she murmured. Frank arched a brow. "Yeah, where else would I be?" She studied him for a moment before responding. "Some men would have left," Frank scoffed. "I'm not most men." A hint of something close to amusement flickered in her gaze. "No. You are. Not you are not good. You." Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but charged, like something unspoken hung between them, waiting to be addressed. Frank exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "So last night," she nodded, watching him carefully. "It changed something." He swallowed. "Yeah. You regret it?" Frank hesitated. "Regret? No, but things were complicated now. He had spent years building a life that kept people at a distance. Now there was someone in his bed, someone who wasn't even from this world, and the worst part, it didn't feel wrong." Frank exhaled sharply. "No, I don't." She studied him carefully, as if searching for cracks in his words. Then slowly she nodded. "Good." Frank smirked slightly. "That's it. Just good." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes, good." She started to sit up, but she shifted. Her body tensed, a sharp inhale slipped from her lips, and she pressed a hand to her ribs. Frank was up in an instant, his instincts firing before he could think. "What is it?" Shook her head, but he could see the tightness in her expression. "It is nothing." Frank narrowed his eyes. "You're a bad liar," she sighed, as if debating whether or not to tell him. Then Finalish moved the blanket aside, revealing her side. Frank swore under his breath. A deep bruise bloomed along her ribs, dark against her blue skin. How the hell did you? His eyes widened as the realization hit. The crash. She had been thrown from the wreckage and he hadn't even noticed. Guilt settled in his stomach. Why didn't you say something before? She met his gaze, unflinching. It was not the worst pain I have felt. Frank clenched his jaw. That's not the point. She watched him for a long moment, then exhaled. I did not want to seem weak. Frank stared at her, then without a word he reached for his medical kit. She frowned. Frank'll get up and let me help you? To his surprise, she didn't argue. She let him press careful fingers against her ribs, checking for breaks. She didn't flinch, but her breathing hitched slightly. When reached the deepest part of the bruise, Frank exhaled through his nose. Nothing's broken, but damn lucky. You need to take it easy. She nodded, but he could tell she wouldn't listen. He sighed. Promise me. She blinked as if their quest surprised her. Then finally she nodded. I promise. Frank wrapped the bruise carefully, his hands steady. Despite the heat simmering between them, she watched him the entire time, her gaze unreadable. When he finished, he sat back, rubbing his jaw. All right, that should help. She studied him for a long moment, then softly said, You're gentle. Frank huffed a laugh. Don't let that get around. She smiled, small but real. For the first time she looked at peace. Frank exhaled, running a hand down his face. He was in deeper than had ever meant to be, and for the first time in a long time he wasn't serious-minded. Frank had spent years preparing for the worst. Out here in Fueled, survival was simple. It was about firewood and fresh water, about keeping the roof patched before the storms rolled in, about knowing which sounds in the night meant danger, and which meant the forest breathing. Survival was not waking up with an alien woman tangled in his sheets. It was not tracing the curve of her shoulder with his fingertips before realizing what he was doing. It was not watching golden eyes flicker open, filled with something unspoken, and yet here he was, Zora stretched beneath the blankets, exhaling a soft, satisfied sigh. I slept well. Frank smirked. Yeah, I noticed. She rolled onto her side, resting her chin against her palm as she studied him. You did not. Frank huffed, rubbing a hand over his face. Not used to company. Zara watched him carefully. You do not regret it. Frank exhaled, staring at the wooden beams above. No. She reached out, tracing her fingers along the back of his hand. Good. They lay there in silence, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world outside heavy with snow. Eventually, Frank forced himself to sit up. We should check the crash. Zarella tends beside him. Frank noticed. He turned to face her. Something I should know. She hesitated, then slowly she sat up as well, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. I told you before, my ship was not meant to survive. Neither was I. Frank studied her, waiting. She exhaled. If the wreckage remains, it may still hold a signal. Frank frowned. The distress beacon. She shook her head. A warning. If they come, it will not be to rescue me. Frank's chest tightened. He had known deep down that this wasn't over, that whoever had tried to kill her wouldn't just give up. Still, hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn. He stood, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Then we'd better move before someone else does. Zira Harrows as well, though not as quickly. Frank caught the slight wince as she straightened his jaw, tightening ribs. Still bothering you? She exhaled through her nose. They are healing. Frank didn't believe that for a second, but he didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed an extra coat and tossed it to her. She caught it easily, her movements far more fluid than they had been the night before. He narrowed his eyes. You recover fast. A ghost of a smirk touched her lips. Adapt. Frank grunted. Noted. They stepped outside into the biting cold. The snow stretched untouched in every direction save for a faint indentation where the storm had buried her initial impact. No tracks. Frank wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Zora fell into step beside him as they made their way toward the crater. The silence between them wasn't awkward but charged, like they both knew the peace of last night had been temporary. As they reached the site, Frank slowed. The wreckage was still there, partially buried, jagged metal and scorched earth peeking through the snow, but something was off. Zarella saw it too. She stiffened, knees narrowing. Frank raised his rifle. Tell me I'm not crazy. Zara didn't answer. She steps forward, kneeling beside a piece of the hull. Her fingers traced a faint scorch mark, but not from the crash. The burn pattern was too precise. Frank's stomach dropped. That's from a weapon, isn't it? Sar's expression darkened. Yes. Frank scanned the tree line, his grip tightening on the rifle. Then someone's already been here. Zara exhaled, pressing her palm against the wreckage. A faint hum resonated beneath her touch, the metal pulsing once before flickering out. Signal is dead, she murmured. They silenced it. Frank clenched his jaw. Which means they know you're alive. She met his gaze, golden eyes steady. Yes. Frank surrendered. His breath. He had spent years avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, staying out of things that weren't his concern, but this wasn't something he could walk away from, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. He exhaled sharply, lowering thereafter. Then we don't wait for them to come to us. Zara blinked. You wish to? Frank smirked. I don't wish to, but if we're going to have company, I'd rather not be sitting on my ass when they show up. Zarella studied him, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. Then slowly she nodded. Then we move. Frank turned toward the cabin, already making a mental checklist of what they'd need. Zarella fell into step beside him, and as they walked, she reached out, curling her fingers around his. Frank hesitated for only a second, then without a word he held on. The storm had passed, but something heavier hung in the air. Frank and Zara moved through the trees in silence, their breaths mistinged in the cold morning air. The wreckage behind them told a story neither of them wanted to face. Someone had found the crash site first, someone who didn't want survivors. They didn't have long before Waver silenced that beacon came looking. Frank's grip tightened around his rifle as he led them toward a ridge overlooking the valley. From here he could see for miles his cabin, the thick stretch of forest, the long road that wound down the mountain. Everything he had built, everything that had been his world for the last few years, he was about to leave it behind. Beside him, Zara watched him carefully. You are thinking of staying? Frank exhaled sharply. Doesn't matter what I want. They'll come, won't they? Zara's golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. Yes. Frank ran a hand through his hair, staring at the horizon. Damn it. He had built this life to escape Wardo, escape the weight of responsibility. Now here he was, about to throw himself into a fight that wasn't his. But then again, maybe it was. He turned to look. There she stood, tall despite her injuries, her silver hair catching the morning light, her skin warmed by the rising sun. She was strong, resilient, but beneath it all he saw what she wouldn't say she wasted of running. And Frank, he was tired of watching people he cared about get left behind. His jaw tightened. All right, Zarella frowned. Frank nodded. Once we go, we leave the mountain, we figure out what's coming and how to stop it. She studied him, searching for hesitation, finding none. Ash nodded. We will need supplies. Frank smirked. Lucky for you. I'm a paranoid bastard. They returned to the cabin quickly, grabbing only what they needed: ammunition, food, medical supplies. Frank worked efficiently, but there was something strange about packing his life into a single bag. When he reached the fireplace, he hesitated. He had spent years in Thescaben. Every piece of it was him. The rough-hewn walls, the battered furniture, firewood he had stacked just days ago. It was the closest thing to home he had ever known. Zira's voice was quiet. You do not have to leave Thisband. Frank exhaled through his nose. Yeah, I do. She stepped closer. Because of me? Frank turned to her. Because of them. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He reached for his coat, slinging the bag over his shoulder. Let's go. Thea stepped outside just as the wind shifted. Frank stilled. Something wasn't right. The forest was too quiet. Zara must have sensed it too, because she stiffened beside him, her golden eyes scanning the tree line. Frank's instincts flared. Years of military training snapped into place as he reached for his rifle, positioning himself between her and the woods, then saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, too fast, too deliberate. Frank's match dropped. They were already here. He didn't have time to warn Zara before the first shot rang out. He grabbed her, yanking her down behind the porch railing just as something whizzed past. The sear snow exploded where the bullet struck. Frank swore. You recognize them? Zara's expression darkened. Yes, friends of yours. No. Frank gritted his teeth, peering through the gaps in the wood. At least 3 figures, maybe more, moving in a formation he recognized all too well. They weren't here to negotiate. Heinhold deeply studying himself. Then he turned to Zara. How fast can you run, chef? Round. I do not plan to asking what you plan to do. I'm asking how fast you reach. Held his gaze for a beat, then nodded. Fast enough. Frank exhaled sharply. Good. When I say go, you head for the ridge, stick to the trees, move low, don't stop. Zara's jaw tightened. And you? Frank smirked, checking his rifle. I've got a welcoming party to handle. She stared at him, something flickering behind her eyes. Then, to his surprise, she leaned forward, quick stain, and kissed him. Not like last night, not hesitant, not testing. This wassalid, a promise, a tether. When she pulled back, her golden eyes burned. Do not get yourself killed, Frank. Frank's smirk whitened. Wouldn't dream of it. Then, before he could second guess himself, he turned and fired the first shot. By the time Frank reached the ridge, his knuckles were raw and his breathing sharp. Snow clung to his clothes, dirt smeared across his hands. But he weighs alive, and more importantly, so was she. Zara stood at the edge of the overlook staring at the valley below. She turned when she heard him approach, relief flashing across her face before she masked it. Frank exhaled, rolling his shoulder. Well, that was fun. Zara arched a brow. Your definition of fun is questionable. Frank chuckled. You're not wrong. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy this time. It wasn't the silence of two people holding back. It was the silence of understanding. Zara glanced back at the valley. They will not stop. Frank followed her gaze. No, they won't. She turned to him fully. Then neither will we. Frank studied her just days ago. She had been a stranger, a freezing, injured alien stranger who had crash landed into his life. Now she was something else, something his. He smirked. Guess we better keep moving. Then she nodded, stepping beside him together. Frank reached for her hand, curling his fingers around hers. Yeah, together as they walked away from the only home he had ever known. Frank realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't leaving something behind. He was going somewhere, and he wasn't going alone.